Joyce, Leslie, Stephanie, Priya, Alice, Penny, and more. Today we're going to go through each of Leonard's girlfriends or love interests to understand the patterns that emerge, and also understand why Leonard can't be truly happy, at least until something changes. We're going to dive into Leonard's mind, his childhood, his fears, to understand him better. Of course, I already made a character analysis of Leonard, but I realise I have a lot more to say about his dating history, his love story, and the psychology that accompanies it. Leonard is constantly trying to reach a point where someone somewhere finally responds to him with a stable, unambiguous sense of approval. Not just attraction or affection, but the feeling that he is objectively enough. For a sitcom character, he goes through an awful lot of emotional turmoil and suffering. So this time I've been thinking about Leonard's relationships. In order to understand them, we must first rewind. And in case you've not seen the announcement, the final analysis for the main 7 Big Bang Theory characters on Barnett is on the way. If you follow the Big Bang Theory close enough, the reasons for Leonard's romantic conditioning go back long before the events of the show. It all begins in childhood. More specifically, it begins with Leonard's relationship with his mother, Dr. Beverly Hofstadter. I'm sure you already knew that. If you've ever watched a Beverly episode, this is fairly intuitive. This is a mother who is distant, clinical, and who deprives him of love and approval. A mother who observes her son more than she seems to emotionally receive him. Who responds to his experiences as data points rather than moments. For Leonard, this creates a very specific internal model of love. Love is not something you simply receive. It is something you must be accurate enough to deserve. It's something you must present yourself correctly for, and something that might be withheld if you are not precise, intelligent, or correct enough to earn it. And once that framework is formed early enough, it doesn't just persist through childhood, it becomes the template for life. So when Leonard grows up and enters romantic relationships, he is not entering them as a blank slate, he is entering them with a pre-existing emotional question already running in the background. What do I have to do to finally be approved of? And that question reshapes everything that follows. It affects who he is drawn to. It affects who he stays with. It affects who feels right and who feels empty, even when on paper they are kind, loving, or available. Because for Leonard, emotional safety is not automatically interpreted as love. An approval that comes too easily does not feel like certainty. Uncertainty is more like it. Unstable. Destabilizing, to the point of destruction. So what we see across his relationships is not random incompatibility. I wouldn't even call it bad luck. I think a better way to look at this is a pattern of emotional calibration. Leonard is constantly trying to recreate a very specific feeling. The feeling of being just close enough to approval that if he tried a little harder, he might finally secure it. And every relationship becomes a different version of that attempt. Some are too cold, some are too warm, some are complicated enough to feel meaningful but unstable enough to keep him striving, and one relationship more than any other becomes the centre of this entire system. But before we get there, the pattern is already visible in the earliest stages of his romantic life, in the way he responds to various women who each bring or take something different. Before we get into the strange dichotomy of Leslie and Stephanie, I want to acknowledge Joyce Kim. It's easy to forget because it happens before the events of the Big Bang Theory, but psychologically it does matter. The reason I'm not giving her own chapter is because it wasn't a proper relationship, more like a one-night stand, but it's still relevant because Leonard genuinely likes Joyce. He opens himself up to her, he trusts her, and then he discovers this potential relationship wasn't simply unsuccessful, it was built on deception. Now, of course, this is played for comedy. It's an absurd sitcom premise. But emotionally, Leonard still experiences something real. His first significant, adult, romantic experience teaches him that vulnerability is dangerous. Notice what makes this different from his childhood with Beverly. His mother taught him that love had to be earned. Joyce teaches him that even if you do earn someone's attention, they may not actually be there for you at all. They may not be who you thought they were. They may disappear. Beverly creates attachment issues, Joyce creates trust issues. Together, they produce a particularly anxious way of approaching relationships. Leonard doesn't simply seek approval anymore, he also searches constantly for reassurance that the approval is genuine. You can see echoes of this throughout the series. Leonard frequently seeks verbal confirmation of how his partners feel. He worries about hidden motives, changing feelings, and whether people really mean what they say. He often appears needy, but underneath that behaviour is a question. Is this real, or am I misunderstanding things again? I'm not saying she is anywhere as significant as his mother, but Joyce still has an important impact on Leonard. She confirms that emotional closeness can vanish without warning, and that trusting someone carries genuine risk. So by the time we meet Leonard in the pilot, he isn't simply looking for love, he's looking for proof that love can be trusted, and that makes the relationships that follow feel even more significant. Before Penny, before Priya, before Leonard's emotional life becomes fully entangled in long-term attachment and loss, there are two relationships that establish the rules of the game he doesn't realise he's playing. Leslie Winkle and Stephanie Barnett are often treated as minor characters in the show. Brief arcs, transitional relationships, stepping stones to the real relationships. But they are doing something quite important. They are defining the two extremes of Leonard's emotional tolerance. And what's striking is this: neither of them is wrong for him. Leonard struggles when love does not match his internal model of what love is supposed to feel like, and Leslie and Stephanie sit on opposite ends of that model. Leslie Winkle represents a very specific kind of emotional environment for Leonard, one that is intellectually engaging, socially present, but emotionally non-affirming. She is sharp, independent, dismissive. She engages with Leonard on equal footing, but not in a way that centers him emotionally. There is no strong sense that Leonard is being chosen in any meaningful, stabilizing way, and this creates an interesting effect in him. Instead of deep attachment, we see something closer to neutrality with friction. He is interested, yes, he is stimulated, but there is no escalation into longing, no sustained emotional dependency, because Leslie does not provide the key ingredient Leonard is unconsciously calibrated to seek, a sense that he is being evaluated for approval. With Leslie, there is no real test being administered, and paradoxically that removes the psychological space he usually occupies in relationships. It's actually quite complex. Let me just pause here and highlight something. What Leonard is not drawn to is security. We may assume that, but it's not quite right. What Leonard is drawn to is the possibility of being approved, the possibility of being confirmed. In other words, he needs to earn it. Leslie, in that sense, gives him too little. It never fully becomes a pursuit, it never fully becomes a need, and so she fades from his emotional system almost as quickly as she enters it, which tells us something important. Despite what we may assume about a lonely nerd, Leonard is not indiscriminately attached to anyone who is available. He is way more selective than we might presume. He requires a specific emotional tension for attachment to activate. So moving on, if Leslie represents emotional distance without pursuit, Stephanie represents the opposite problem entirely. Stephanie Barnett is warm, attentive, and openly affectionate. She offers Leonard something he is far less familiar with: consistent, unambiguous approval. She likes him, and she expresses it. She behaves as if he is already enough, and this should, in theory, feel safe. This should be exactly what Leonard needs. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Are we forgetting about Leonard's childhood? As we said, for Leonard, approval without effort does not register as stability. There is no internal struggle, no emotional obstacle, and there's no sense that something is being earned over time. And without that structure, Leonard begins to lose his grip on the relationship's meaning. And for someone whose emotional development is shaped around the idea that love must be validated through, for want of better words, struggle, this creates a strange psychological gap. If nothing is being tested, then what exactly is being proven? So instead of deepening attachment, Leonard begins to withdraw, of his own accord, and it's because she's not activating the familiar pattern of striving. Stephanie's affection arrives easily, and so Leonard cannot locate his usual internal role, the person trying to become worthy, and without that role, he becomes disoriented, so he disengages. We're only 2 girlfriends into the story and it's already complex, don't you think? Anyway, taken together, Leslie and Stephanie reveal something essential about Leonard's relational psychology. I think we can call it the need for structured uncertainty. Leslie offers no emotional test, Stephanie offers no emotional obstacle. To oversimplify it, too much, too little. And so Leonard remains suspended between 2 extremes, and now we understand the relationships that come after are attempts to find a specific emotional middle point between these 2 poles. And once the pattern is established, it becomes much easier to understand why the next relationship, Priya, feels so much more significant to him. But just before we move on to Priya, there are 2 other significant events in Leonard's love life. The first is Dr. Elizabeth Plimpton. Elizabeth is one of the clearest examples of Leonard misunderstanding what emotional significance actually feels like. The encounter feels charged, unusual, and briefly exciting precisely because it sits outside his normal romantic hierarchy. Leonard interprets the intensity of the moment as emotional depth. He reads novelty as connection and validation as meaning. So when the encounter happens, he quickly attaches significance to it, not just as attraction, but as something special between them. This is why his later line, "I thought we had something special," matters, I think, because it exposes the gap between Leonard's emotional interpretation and reality. For Plimpton, the encounter is casual, exploratory, and not emotionally anchored. There is no hidden relationship forming beneath it, no developing attachment, no shared romantic trajectory. It is simply an interaction that Leonard over-invests in because it temporarily satisfies his need to feel chosen in an unusual context. And I think that's the key point. In fact, let's pause here. Leonard doesn't just struggle with rejection, he struggles with reading intimacy. Yet another incompatible love interest, this time because there is no shared emotional framework at all. And then, the second character is Mrs. Latham. She's an equally brief occurrence in Leonard's love life, but the dynamic she represents is familiar. She is older, intelligent, socially dominant, and emotionally self-contained. And she places Leonard in a position where approval feels structured, conditional, and slightly out of reach. In many ways, she mirrors the relational template Leonard grew up with, authority mixed with evaluation. The kind of presence where affection is implied but never freely given without performance. Leonard even directly acknowledges the resemblance when he says she reminds him of his mother, and I think that line is doing more psychological work than it first appears, and I'm going to move on here before it gets too Freudian. The point is, what draws him in is not simply attraction, but recognition. Mrs. Latham activates the same emotional pattern Leonard has been navigating since childhood. The sense that closeness must be earned through intellect and politeness and compliance. She's a familiar system, just in a different face. And it's these two events, along with everything that came before, that makes the next chapter of Leonard's romantic history a breath of fresh air, at least at first. Priya Koothrappali represents something far more psychologically charged for Leonard. She represents conditional approval. And for Leonard Hofstadter, conditional approval is not just another relationship dynamic. It is almost a perfect match for the emotional template he has been carrying since childhood, because Priya does something neither Leslie nor Stephanie fully did. She offers Leonard a sense that he is being chosen, but only under specific terms. At first, Priya feels like progression in his romantic life. She is intelligent, attractive, socially confident. Importantly, she is interested in him. There is real reciprocity here, not the indifference of Leslie or the uncomplicated warmth of Stephanie, but almost immediately there is a constraint placed on that connection. The relationship has to be hidden. It exists partially in secrecy, partially in tension, and partially in negotiation with external forces, her family, her cultural expectations, her obligations back home. And this changes the emotional structure of the relationship in a very specific way. For most people, secrecy and constraint might feel like a barrier to intimacy, but for Leonard it creates something strangely familiar, because conditional love is the environment he already understands. If Beverly Hofstadter taught him anything emotionally, it's that approval is not freely given. It must be earned through precision, correctness, and performance. Priya's relationship structure echoes that logic almost perfectly. She likes him, but not openly. She engages with him, but not without complication. She offers intimacy, but not full belonging, and so Leonard steps into a familiar role without even realizing it. He becomes the person trying to qualify for a relationship, rather than simply existing within one. Over time, the structure of the relationship begins to show its strain, because secrecy does something important to Leonard. It prevents full self-expression. He's not just in a relationship, he's in a relationship that must be managed and contained. And this limits something essential in him, the ability to be fully seen without negotiation. Instead of feeling secure, he begins to inhabit a subtle but persistent state of uncertainty. Not am I loved exactly, but am I allowed to be this version of myself and still be loved? And that question keeps him slightly on edge, but it keeps him trying. From the outside, Priya looks like a step forward compared to Leonard's earlier relationships. There is commitment, there is intimacy and emotional investment on both sides. But Priya only offers negotiated approval, and negotiated approval is powerful for someone like Leonard because it feels like progress without requiring a full break from old patterns. He's still being chosen, but he still has to perform the conditions of being chosen, so the relationship feels meaningful even as it remains structurally unstable. The secrecy and then the long distance that comes later, these factors begin to fracture the relationship rather than hold it together. And when the truth about her infidelity during the long distance phase comes into focus, it does something more damaging than simply ending the relationship. It confirms a fear Leonard has carried through every stage of his life, that even when he does meet the conditions, it still might not be enough. This is the mental residue Priya leaves behind. Not just heartbreak, but reinforcement of the idea that approval is always temporary and conditional. It's yet another betrayal, deception, and as it happens the betrayal is coeval with Penny sleeping with his friend Raj. It's a lot to deal with, but we'll get to Penny later. Despite all this, it is Priya that feels the most emotionally correct to Leonard at this stage in his life, because she recreates the exact psychological loop he knows how to operate inside. Try harder, gain closeness, risk loss, and try harder again. It's exhausting, but it's also familiar, and familiarity for Leonard often gets mistaken for truth. I'd like to know how many of you agree with this, but for me, Alice is one of the most heartbreaking moments in Leonard Hofstadter's story. We don't know an awful lot about her, but from what I can see, he briefly encounters someone who may have been the most psychologically compatible partner he ever met, at least effortlessly compatible, off the bat, if that makes sense. The tragedy is that they meet at exactly the wrong time. At first glance, Alice seems similar to Stephanie. Both are warm, intelligent, and clearly interested in Leonard. But there is one crucial difference. Stephanie chooses Leonard almost immediately. Alice discovers him. She's more gradual, less intense. She doesn't idealize him, she talks to him and challenges him. They spend the evening exchanging ideas, teasing one another, and gradually uncovering a genuine connection. Leonard still has to win her over, but not by chasing her approval. He wins her over simply by being himself. For this early on in the series, this might be the closest Leonard has been to being himself, at least with women. Throughout his life, Leonard has learned that love comes from reducing someone else's uncertainty about him. He believes affection must be earned by proving his worth, by being patient enough, kind enough, and persistent enough. Alice rewrites those rules. The effort is still there, but it's not driven by anxiety anymore. Instead of wondering whether she likes him, Leonard gets to enjoy discovering whether they genuinely fit together. And healthy relationships are not effortless. They still require investment and vulnerability, but they do not require one person constantly wondering if they are enough. Alice offers Leonard something he rarely experiences, the chance to feel chosen without first feeling emotionally deprived. She doesn't keep him guessing, she doesn't withdraw affection to create pursuit, she doesn't make Leonard decode mixed signals, and at the same time she isn't simply handing him unconditional admiration. She has her own interests and opinions and talents, and her own sense of humour, and we can kind of gather all of this from the limited interactions they have. In other words, Leonard experiences the balance he has been missing. Enough challenge to make the connection meaningful, and enough security to make it feel safe. Enough independence that neither person has to carry the other's emotional needs. It's the kind of relationship that Leonard has unknowingly been searching for. But Leonard is already with Priya, so it's really bad timing. And although Priya is cheating on Leonard at this point in time, he's not aware of this and still thinks they're endgame. And I think Alice is one of the greatest missed opportunities for Leonard. He's spent decades confusing anxiety with significance. If a relationship feels uncertain, it feels important. If it feels difficult, it feels valuable. Alice gently challenges that belief, or she was beginning to, but didn't have the chance to fully teach him that lesson. And because the lesson was interrupted, he returns to the pattern he understands best. A pattern built on striving, uncertainty, and the hope that if he can just prove himself one more time, he'll finally feel worthy of love. And that pattern will reach its ultimate conclusion with Penny, eventually. Just before we get to Penny, I want to mention Alex. Alex Jensen briefly introduces a different question into Leonard's romantic life. Could he actually be happy with someone other than Penny? Unlike many of Leonard's past relationships, Alex is clear, consistent, and straightforward. She is openly interested in him, and their connection develops through normal reciprocity and mutual interests, rather than uncertainty or emotional games. On paper, this is a healthier dynamic than what Leonard is used to. There's nothing to decode, and no need to earn basic affection through anxiety or persistence. In that sense, Alex represents a more stable form of compatibility. But of course, Leonard doesn't pursue it because he's with Penny. And I think the part of the narrative function is not only showing Leonard that he's desirable to other women, but it's also testing him. And he passes the test, at least at this point in the story. But she also becomes evidence that Leonard could be with someone else, and that he might even be happier in a more reciprocal dynamic. But it's also proof that he's not yet willing to step outside the relationship that defines his emotional framework. But the truth is, Alex couldn't ever come close to what Penny represents to him, and the reason is quite complicated. If Leonard's relationships form a pattern, she's the axis around which it rotates. Penny is the closest thing Leonard ever has to a lifelong target. She is initially unreadable, in exactly the way he has been trained to respond to. And what makes this dynamic so interesting is that Penny does not stay one version of herself. She changes, she evolves over time, and in so doing, she transforms Leonard's entire emotional landscape on multiple occasions. In the beginning, Penny is unavailable in a very specific way. She is socially open but emotionally ambiguous, friendly but not anchored, warm but not committed, present but not fully accessible. Not to mention, Leonard and the other characters consider her to be way out of his league, and yet Leonard senses that there may be something there between them. So if he can earn this woman's approval, this woman who is seemingly impossible to obtain, sound familiar? That's the ultimate goal Leonard has been chasing his whole life. And for Leonard, this is the perfect storm. She is close enough to imagine approval, but inconsistent enough that it must still be earned. He must climb the mountain, and it's a steep and dangerous one. And so Leonard does what he always does in this emotional structure. He invests, he tries harder, because early Penny activates the exact psychological loop he understands. If I can just become slightly better, slightly more noticeable, slightly more worthy, I might be chosen. And that might is everything. It keeps him engaged, it keeps him hoping. And at the start it seems like such a small might. It's the same reason we buy lottery tickets with a 1,000,000 to 1 chance of winning. Anyway, it keeps him emotionally organised around her. But crucially, nothing is stable yet. So Penny becomes less of a person in his life at this stage and more of a moving horizon. Yeah, let's go with that analogy. It's like chasing the moon into the horizon. Always visible, never secure. But over time something changes. Penny matures emotionally, becomes more grounded and more self-aware. She's more consistent in her feelings towards Leonard. And this is where the paradox begins, because the thing Leonard has been chasing, her approval, starts to become available, but Penny, due to her own fears, pulls back frequently. Sometimes she is available and sometimes she isn't, and although he suffers in this period, this is exactly where he thrives. But the interesting part is when she becomes consistently available, when she lowers her defenses, when she actually offers her full and unconditional love, there are problems. Because Leonard's emotional system was built in pursuit of uncertainty, so when Penny becomes stable, the structure that defined their entire dynamic begins to dissolve. He's caught up with the moon, he's found the horizon, the challenge disappears, and with it, the familiar emotional role Leonard has always occupied, the person trying to earn his place. At this point, Penny shifts from being something Leonard must chase to something he must choose, and that sounds like progress, but it creates disorientation. Because being chosen was never the problem Leonard was trained to solve. He already knows how to operate inside pursuit. What he doesn't know how to do is operate inside a rival. So the relationship becomes something new. Leonard knows how to chase love and yearn and hope, but he doesn't know how to be loved. And this is the crucial point. This is where Leonard's deeper pattern begins to surface more clearly. As Penny becomes more available, Leonard begins to destabilize the relationship in subtle ways. Through moments of hesitation, miscommunication, small ruptures that reintroduce the feeling of instability, the instability he's more comfortable navigating. And this could explain his brief mistake, shall we call it, with Mandy, and it would explain why he brought this mistake up on the day of his wedding. When love becomes too secure, Leonard unconsciously reintroduces complexity, because complexity restores meaning. If there is no struggle, there is no sense of earning, and if there is no earning, the emotional system he has relied on for his entire adult life begins to shut down. So Penny becomes something deeply contradictory in Leonard's life. She is both the person he wants the most and the emotional state he does not know how to sustain. Eventually though, Penny does something that changes the structure again. She doesn't leave. Even when Leonard is imperfect, when he makes mistakes, even when he is uncertain, even when he fails to behave in the exact way his early relationships would have required for continued approval, she stays. And that act, repeated over time, begins to introduce something new. Not proof that he must earn love, but proof that he does not have to constantly prove himself. And this slowly begins to weaken the old pattern. Penny matters because she forces Leonard into a situation he has never had to truly live inside, a relationship where approval is no longer conditional but continuous, and that creates the final psychological tension of his whole character arc, because once approval is no longer something to earn, he has to figure out who he is without the struggle, and that question leads directly into the next stage of his development. By the time Leonard reaches a stable relationship structure with Penny, something unusual happens inside him. Externally, things look like progress. Commitment increases and intimacy deepens. The relationship becomes more grounded and more reciprocal. But internally, a quieter tension begins to emerge, because Leonard is discovering something he has very little prior experience with. A relationship that does not require constant emotional effort to maintain. And for most people that would feel like relief. But for Leonard, it's scary. The key to understanding Leonard at this stage is recognizing that his emotional system was built around activation. Activation means trying to win someone over, resolving ambiguity, reading emotional signals, and adjusting behavior to maintain connection. In that system, love is something you do. So when a relationship becomes stable, the entire system loses its function. There is no ambiguity to solve, no approval to decode, no emotional test to pass, which causes Leonard to experience a subtle loss of orientation. But Leonard's emotional development comes in the form of a gradual weakening of a lifelong belief. That belief is that love must be earned and that he is incapable of earning it. Penny becomes central to this process because she introduces consistency into a system that previously ran on inconsistency. But crucially, she doesn't offer this from the start. Due to her own hang-ups, and I'd be happy to discuss them in another video, she very gradually introduces Leonard to the idea of unconditional love. And maybe this was the only way for Leonard to learn. It sounds wrong, but maybe Leonard had to suffer first, because his original emotional blueprint is tied to his mother. For much of his life, Beverly functions as an internal measurement system, not just of who he is, but of whether who he is sufficient, and part of Leonard's growth comes from something very important. He begins to stop using her as that measurement, because he slowly realizes that her emotional framework is not the universal standard he once assumed it was. Her distance is not a puzzle to solve, and is not a verdict on his worth. Eventually, this disintegrates the idea that approval from her is the final answer to his self-worth. In fact, eventually it removes the idea that his self-worth is attached to the approval of anyone. There is also something important in Leonard's relationship with forgiveness, especially towards his mother, but also toward himself. Forgiveness is about release, releasing the belief that emotional distance must be solved in order to be valid, releasing the idea that love always contains an evaluative component, and most importantly, releasing himself from the need to constantly interpret his worth through the reactions of others. Though it may not appear outwardly dramatic, we can see this in the scene where he forgives his mother in the final season. What you are seeing is the release of psychological tension that has been present since childhood, and I think it's one of the most significant scenes in the entire show. The loop that once defined his relationships, distance, effort, approval, temporary security, and more distance, starts to lose its dominance. Not all at once, but enough that a new pattern becomes possible. Presence, stability, trust, continuation. That shift is hard to pick up on from the outside because at the end of the day, this is a sitcom, it's a comedy show. But when you notice it, it means love is no longer something Leonard has to continuously justify his place within. A question the audience often circles around is whether Leonard is fundamentally broken. I think the answer is no. I think the answer is that he has simply adapted to a system where emotional distance was normalized. And what we see across his relationships is not damage in a simplistic sense, but adaptation that no longer serves him as he matures. And by the end, I think if we were to try and summarize what happens, Leonard finally understands that love is something he is allowed. Love is not a destination. Love is a journey that never ends. But it's a journey you take with someone rather than towards someone. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, a thumbs up goes a long way. Subscribe for more content like this, hit the notification bell, follow on Instagram for updates. Let me know who or what you would like a video on next. A special thank you to my Patreon supporters Carbon Atom, Greg Whitworth, Star Laura, Casey, Daniel, Carlos Diaz, Keenan Smith, and Beverly. See you in the next video.